I'm making up some slants for the king oyster culture that I've made from my own spores. And I have these 8 dishes, actually 7 dishes here. One of the dishes got contaminated. You can see how there's very little growth in the center, and then all that splotchiness around as either a bacteria or yeast in there. But that can be expected with the a second transfer from spores. But it is interesting to see the variation and the different styles of how these semi-isolates, I guess you'd call them, because each one is from a different area of the dish. It contains a different set of strains within the king oyster complex. You can see this one's pretty cottony and thick. It's actually the one I'm going to use to put on my slants. This one's about as thick, but not as cottony, about the same distance of growth. Okay, what I'm looking for is how thickly running the mycelium is, how thick and cottony white it is, how far it's grown compared to the other dishes in the short amount of time, because I've tried to cut the individual transfer pieces the same size so I get an idea of to compare them. See, this one's pretty cottony too. Not as much radial growth. Same, pretty much. Now these two, you can see they've grown out pretty far, but notice they're not dense white. At least not as dense as the other ones. Now, for oyster mushrooms, that is not necessarily a bad thing. And in the past, I would have selected the fastest growing dish, even if it didn't look cottony white. That's because the faster it grows, it's going to colonize your spawn or straw or cottonseed hulls much faster. And of course, that's also the same reason why it's not so dense white, is because the mycelium has spread out more thinly. But usually the rule of thumb is you want to get a nice fast growing but nice thick white. That's pretty much for any strain of mushrooms you're trying to do an isolate from. Now, this one dish is probably composed of hundreds, if not thousands, of individual mycelial strains competing for the food. And some of those strains will mate with each other, and maybe some won't. When they fuse together, the process is called anastomosis, and it pretty much averages the DNA for the entire dish. So by the time you get an isolate, or by the time you get an actual fruit that you can clone from, the number of strains has been reduced to maybe only 3 or 4. I don't think you can actually ever really get down to one strain without having some microscopy and careful separation involved. But yeah, you can get down to just a handful of strains, and those ones will average out a tiny bit. So always at the start it's a bit of a roll of the dice, but I'm going to try to keep track of the liquid cultures that I eventually make with these, and we'll see if they have different speeds of colonization, and maybe even different fruiting times, how fast they'll fruit off and how much they'll fruit. And my experience with oyster mushrooms in general is that even isolates, you know, you're going to end up with the same yield per time per food, pretty much, with oyster mushrooms.